The smell of wet pine pitch hit first, sharp and bitter, and then the snow came sideways out of the dark, rattling against Cal Mercer's hat brim like thrown grit. Somewhere above the tree line, a dead limb cracked under the weight of the storm and dropped with a sound like a rifle shot. In that kind of cold, even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Cal stood with one hand on the shaft of his lantern and looked into the whiteout swallowing the trail behind them. He had once worn a game-warden badge on this frontier. Then the poachers had framed him for a slaughter he tried to stop, and the badge came off for good. Since then, men looked at him like a warning sign. He had taken this last job anyway, because winter was closing the timber country, because the railhead was still 2 hard days east, and because a man with no reputation can still count. The wounded surveyor rode the little freight sled half upright, one arm wrapped tight around his side where the bandages were already darkening. Nathan Vale kept his chin up, but every breath shivered through him. Beside him sat his daughter, Elsie, small as a fence-post shadow in her wool coat, her face pale and still. She did not speak. She hardly blinked, but her hand never left the satchel pressed to her lap, as if she understood its weight better than anyone else did. Cal noticed that satchel the moment they'd set out, too stiff at the seams, too carefully tied, not the sort of bag a surveyor used for sandwiches and pencils. When Nathan had shifted it, something inside had knocked once, dull and metallic, a folded map maybe, or something wrapped around one. Cal had said nothing then. Out here, questions could wait. The woods had their own opinions, and they were never friendly. They moved under a ceiling of black branches and falling snow, the runners of the sled whispering over crusted ground. This was wolf-haunted timber, the old hands called it, where even a bad trail could go quiet fast. Cal kept the lead rope short and his eyes on the tree line. Every few hundred yards he checked the bark for cut marks, the snow for prints, the wind for any smell that did not belong. Wet fur, smoke, old meat. Human hands always left a stink if you knew how to read it. Then he saw the first sign, a pine trunk on the left, split with a fresh notch high enough to be a signal, a road marker. Old, hidden, deliberate. The Vorga clan used that road, and nobody else did unless they wanted trouble. Cal stopped so suddenly the sled rope went taut, and Elsie's head lifted a little toward him. Ahead, half buried in the snow, lay a strip of fur tied to a branch with red thread. A warning, or a message. Cal couldn't tell which yet, but he knew this much. They were not alone on the trail, and somebody had already decided where the strangers were supposed to die. If you want more cold, hard survival stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. Cal cut the fur strip loose and let it fall into the snow. For a moment, nobody spoke. The sleet ticked against the pines, and the sled creaked under Nathan Vale's shifting weight. Elsie watched Cal with those still, pale eyes of hers, then looked past him into the trees, as if she already knew the woods were listening too. He knelt beside the branch and rubbed the red thread between his fingers. Vorga work. Fine knot. Dry dye. This was a road sign, placed on purpose, meant for men who knew how to read a forest like a map. Cal rose slowly and scanned the trunks on both sides of the trail. More notches. 2 of them, half hidden by rime, at shoulder height. A message line. Old clan habit. Nathan swallowed and winced. Are they near? Close enough to smell our fire if we made one, Cal said. He did not say the rest. They were close enough to kill for a satchel if they thought there was something inside worth more than a winter ride. And Cal knew there was. He swung the lantern low and studied the snow at their feet. The drifts were building fast now, feathering over the runner tracks and softening the hard edges of the trail. The timber country was already shifting into that mean, half-blind state that made a man trust his ears more than his eyes. A bad sign. An early blizzard meant the pass could close by nightfall, maybe sooner. If they stayed on the road, they'd be easy to follow. If they left it, they could vanish, or disappear forever. Cal looked back at the sled. There's an old charcoal hut east of here, half-rotted, maybe worse, but it has a stone stove. If it's still standing, we use it. Nathan gave a weak nod, too tired to argue. Elsie lifted one mittened hand and pointed once, sharply, toward the dark slope above the trail. Cal followed her finger and saw it then, a patch of snow that had settled too cleanly over a low shape, the kind of shape that shouldn't be there if the ground was plain. A deadfall line, not natural, set to catch a sled or a man's leg. He crouched, brushed away the crust, and found a thin wire buried under the white skin of the trail. Cold iron, tight as a fiddle string. One jerk and the whole slope above them would speak. Cal's mouth went dry. That was a warning from the Vorga clan itself. He reached down, snapped the wire with his knife, and did not like the way the line disappeared into the brush. Too neat, too fresh. Someone had laid this trap after the storm started. That meant men were still moving in the timber. Behind them, far off, a wolf howled once, curious. Cal bundled the satchel tighter against Nathan's side, then took the lead rope in one hand and the lantern in the other. "Stay close," he told them. "From here on, we walk like we're already half dead." And as they turned off the road toward the black slope, a thin curl of smoke rose between the trees ahead, from somewhere that should have been empty. The smoke did not come from any honest hearth. Cal kept the lantern low and guided the sled down the last slope with the kind of care a man uses when he knows the ground may decide to break under him. The charcoal burner's hut crouched in a hollow beneath black spruces, half sunk into drift, its roof sagging under a skin of snow so thick it looked embalmed. One wall had burned long ago and never quite recovered. The whole place smelled of old soot, wet ash, and cold rot. In that 30 below dark, even the snow seemed mean. Nathan coughed hard enough to bend him double, then clutched at the satchel again. Elsie shifted closer to him without a word, one mitten pressed against his sleeve, the other hand flat over the bag in her lap. Cal saw her watching the hut, not with fear exactly, but with that quiet, careful stare children get when they have already learned the world can bite. He knew the look. He had worn it himself years back, before the badge, before the lie that ruined him. He left the sled where the trees gave him cover and walked the last steps alone. The door hung on one hinge, and the latch had been replaced by a strip of rawhide. Not new, but not ancient either. Fresh enough to tighten the skin on the back of his neck. He touched the snow at the threshold and found a trail of tiny flakes melted by recent heat. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Inside, the hut was worse. A stove sat in the corner with a blackened kettle on top, one handle wrapped in clean cloth. A dead pine branch had been snapped to feed the fire. On the ash shelf beside the stove, Cal found 3 crumbs of wax from a lantern that had burned recently. A pause place. The kind men used when they knew a storm was swallowing the road and they still needed shelter for an hour, maybe 2. He crouched and saw the other thing, too. A line scratched into the soot beside the stove stones. 3 cuts and a 4th crossing them. Vorga mark. Small, neat, patient. The clan did not waste symbols. Every mark said the same thing in its own way. This trail belongs to us, and the forest takes its due from strangers. Cal backed out of the hut and returned to the sled. "We're not alone," he said. Nathan's face tightened, but he said nothing. Elsie lifted her eyes to Cal, then pointed with one mitten toward the tree line behind the hut. He followed her finger and saw what she saw, a narrow strip of trampled snow leading away from the rear wall, already filling in with fresh fall. A boot track, then another, then a drag mark where something heavy had been pulled into the brush. Cal's hand settled on the knife at his belt. "Inside, now, quiet as mice." He got them into the hut, barred the door with a stove poker, and shoved the sled runners across the threshold as a brace. Then he checked the stove, the walls, the ceiling beams, the crawl space under the floor. Old charcoal burners had used these places to hide from weather and men both. and he trusted no floorboards in a place like this. The stove still held a little heat in the brick, just enough to keep a match alive. He fed it sparingly, the way an old hand feeds a campfire when he expects trouble before morning. Nathan finally broke his silence. "Did you find something?" Cal looked at the satchel, then at the soot mark on the stove. "I found a road sign," he said, "and a warning." Outside, somewhere in the timber, a wolf answered with a low, drawn-out howl, just near enough to remind them the wolves were working the same storm. Then, from the back wall of the hut, came 3 soft taps. Slow, measured, human. Cal. Cal did not answer the taps right away. He stood still in the hut's dirty half-light, one hand lifted for silence, while the stove hissed and the snow whispered at the seams. Then he stepped to the back wall, pressed his palm against the blackened boards, and felt it. A thin draft. Not from the door, from behind the wall. Another tap came, soft as a knuckle on coffin wood, and Elsie's eyes flicked toward him at once. "Stay there," he murmured. He eased the stove poker under a loose plank and worked it free by inches. The wood gave with a tired little sigh. Under the soot, the nails were newer than the rest, bright where the firelight touched them. Somebody had opened this wall before, maybe often. Cal pried the panel wide enough for cold air to breathe out of the gap, and the smell with it was wrong for an abandoned burner hut. Pine tar, wet dog fur, old smoke, and a trace of horse sweat frozen into the grain. Inside was a narrow crawl space, no more than a shoulder deep, but built with purpose. Along one side sat a buried cache wrapped in oilskin, waxed matches, a salt sack, a coil of twine, 2 hard strips of dried meat gone gray with frost. On the far side, cut through the chinking, was a thumb-sized peephole aimed toward the timber. Cal leaned in and looked out. The hut sat in a bowl of dark spruce and drifting snow. Beyond the trunks, 2 hooded lanterns moved in and out of the storm with a slow, patient swing. Not close enough to shoot at, close enough to watch. A third shape crouched near a stump, almost level with the snow, as if it had been there long enough to stop feeling the cold. Vorga, all of it. Men who knew how to wait in a white world and let the world freeze for them. He withdrew from the crawl space and set the board back without sealing it. No sense sealing a wound when you might need it open. Nathan was watching him now, pale and rigid under the blanket. "They're out there?" he asked. Cal nodded once. "And they own the road." Nathan looked at the satchel like it had become heavier in his lap. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with the bitter face of a man giving away the last private thing he has, he opened the outer flap and showed Cal the inner fold of paper tucked inside. Clean survey lines, grid marks, a seam traced in pencil beneath the frozen timber. Not treasure in the fairy tale sense, worse than that. Work that could move men, rails, law, and rifles into a valley that had survived by being forgotten. "If that map gets to the railhead," Nathan whispered, "they'll open the whole basin." "They'll open it anyway," Cal said. "If they can stop you from proving it, they keep their little kingdom." Elsie touched the satchel once, then looked at Cal with that same grave, child-old stare. She understood enough to be frightened, maybe more than enough. So Cal got to work. He hung a tin cup from the rear plank on a short line, then tied another line from the door brace to the sled runner so a hard push would ring the stove. He shoved ash across the floor to catch any prints and packed the crawl space opening with a folded sack so the draft wouldn't carry their heat straight out into the wolf-haunted timber. In a storm like this, the forest takes its due from careless men. He had no intention of paying it. Then the wolves came back, nearer than before, and this time they did not howl. They moved in the timber with that soft, terrible patience only hungry things possess. A branch clicked. Snow scraped wood. Cal felt the sound of it in his teeth. He killed the lantern flame to a blue wick and stood waiting, one hand on the stove poker, the other on the knife at his belt. Outside the peephole, a shadow crossed the snow. Then a gloved hand rose slowly into view, and a blade tip began to probe the back wall from the outside. Cal did not move when the blade touched the wall. The hut had gone so quiet he could hear the thin rasp of metal worrying at the boards, one careful scrape at a time. Whoever stood outside knew exactly where the seam was. That meant they had found the crawl space from the rear, or they'd been here before and remembered it. Either way, the blade was not random. It was a man's hand testing old timber, learning where to slip in. He reached down, took the stove poker in both hands, and eased one step to the side. Nathan was still on the blanket, one fist pressed to his ribs. Elsie had gone motionless beside him, her gaze fixed on Cal's face. She did not ask anything. She just listened, the way children listen when adults forget to lie softly. The blade pushed harder. Cal dropped flat and drove the poker into the floor beside the wall, not to strike flesh, but to make noise. The tin cup he'd hung on the rear plank snapped free and clanged loud as a bell. At once, a shadow jerked back outside, and a low curse came through the boards. A man's voice, close. He'd hoped for wolves. Wolves were honest. He kicked the brace from the door inward and snatched the lantern from the table, not lighting it, just gripping the cold glass. The hut was a black box now, all smell and sound. Smoke, wet wool, fear, and the old pine stink of the crawl space. Cal crawled half a step toward the rear wall and jammed the poker under the loosened plank. Wood groaned. The blade came again, faster this time, and caught the plank edge. Cal drove down with his full weight. There was a sharp crack, then the ugly, wet sound of metal biting into flesh. A hand yanked away from the wall with a strangled oath, just enough to make a man remember his fingers. Cal shoved the plank back into place and shoved the stove poker through the crack behind it, pinning the gap shut for one breath, then two. Outside, boots slid in snow. Someone was backing away. Nathan had dragged himself upright. "How many?" "Enough," Cal said. That answer covered everything and nothing. He looked at Elsie and made a small hand sign toward the rear cache. She understood at once, slipped on her knees to the little bag of oilskin, and brought him the dried meat and twine without a word. Smart girl, quiet as frost. Cal tore the twine free, looped it around the sled runner brace, and tied a quick snare from the rear plank to the stove handle. If anyone forced the wall again, the stove would lurch, spill ash, and ring the tin cup by the door. Not a trap that killed, a trap that told you when death was coming. Outside, the storm thickened. The white hiss against the hut boards grew harder, meaner. Then, for a second, the smell changed. Wood smoke, close. A second fire somewhere in the trees. Cal went to the peephole and looked out. The lanterns were still there, but now one had shifted, and the man carrying it had come into a gap between the trunks. He wore a heavy fur hood and a face wrap, but the shape of his shoulders was familiar. Broad, left shoulder lower than the right. One old injury, maybe broken once and never set clean. Cal had seen that kind of walk before. Vorga. And in that same instant, just beyond the lantern glow, he saw something else moving low in the snow line. Too low for a man, too smooth for a wolf. It paused beneath the pines, then lifted its head toward the hut. Cal felt the blood in him go cold. It had come to answer the knock at the wall. Cal let the first blade probe die against the wall and did not give the men outside the satisfaction of a panic sound. He backed away from the peephole, slow and low, while the hut breathed around him in smoke and frost. The lantern stayed dead in his fist. In the dark, Elsie was a pale shape near the stove, and Nathan a harder shape on the blanket. Both of them listening so hard, it seemed to Cal the whole room had gone to prayer. Another scrape came from the rear boards, a test. Whoever stood out there wanted the opening, but wanted it clean. Cal leaned close to the floor and saw a scatter of ash fall in a thin silver line. The wall was flexing. He crossed to the stove, pulled the poker free, and lifted the pot lid a finger's width. Heat rolled out, dry and bitter, carrying the smell of old iron. He put 2 more chunks of coal on the coals and shut it again. Then he dragged the sled runner brace tighter across the door and knotted the rope with 3 quick turns, the way a man ties off a fuse line when he does not trust the first knot to hold. If the wall gave, the stove would slam, the tin would ring, and he'd know which side the breach came from. Nathan watched him through a fever-glass stare. "You think they'll come in?" "I think they'd rather make us come out." Cal did not say the other part. Men like that like to let hunger do the work first. Wolves, cold, and fear. Then the last push. Elsie touched his sleeve and pointed toward the back wall again. This time Cal saw the motion outside. Not a man, but a low shape nosing the drift beneath the pines. A wolf, half lost in the storm, its shoulders humped against the white. It was too still, too deliberate. The animal lifted its head once toward the hut, and Cal caught the line of a rawhide thong crossing its neck, dark against the snow. A tug line. His jaw tightened. The Vorga weren't just watching the hut. They were steering the woods around it. He put his mouth near Nathan's ear. "How much blood did you lose?" Nathan gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "Enough to interest every bad thing in these trees." "Then keep your hand over it," Cal said, "and keep the girl down." He moved to the crawl space, opened the sack of cache meat, and split 1 strip into narrow pieces with his belt knife. Not a feast, a bait. He rubbed the pieces through stove soot and ash until they smelled wrong, then tied them to the twine he'd already strung from the rear plank. He did not want to kill a wolf if he could help it. He wanted to turn its nose, turn its path, turn the whole black herd of instinct away from the hut and toward the men using it. That was the old wardenship in him, the part that had survived the disgrace. Not shot placement, not glory, herding danger. The tapping came again, 3 slow knocks from behind the wall, then silence. Cal froze. It was not a code he knew. Not yet. Outside, the low shape moved off into the trees, and another answered farther out. Then another. The wolves were spreading into a half ring around the hut, quiet as smoke. Cal felt the hair rise on his neck. The storm was no longer a storm. It was a cover. He reached for the lantern wick, raised it just enough to make a blue point of light, and held it under the rear crack in the boards. Shadow moved there at once, and with it the faint glint of a blade. A man was still working the seam. Then, from the far side of the hut, something big hit the wall hard enough to shake soot from the rafters, and Nathan whispered, "Cal, there's another one under the floor." Cal moved before the wall could give. He hooked one arm under Nathan's shoulder and got the surveyor upright just enough to pull him away from the floor seam. The hut trembled again, hard this time, dust sifting down from the rafters in a gray trickle. From underneath came a dull scrape, then a grunt, then the ugly thud of a boot heel kicking wood from below. Not a wolf, a man. "Up," Cal said, low and sharp. "Both of you, now." Elsie was already on her feet. She did not ask why. She simply took the blanket from Nathan's knees, folded it once, and pressed it into his hands, as if setting a tool back where it belonged. That small motion, so calm and exact, made Cal trust her more than half the men he'd served with. He crossed the room in 2 steps and dragged the stove poker free. The board over the crawl space kicked again, harder, and a line of ash puffed up through the crack. Cal jammed the poker down into the gap, then drove the heel of his boot into the floor beside it. The board split with a snap. A hand lunged up through the dark, gloved fingers curling for purchase. Cal brought the poker down across the wrist. There was a wet crack under the fur. The hand vanished with a howl that turned into choking breath. Cal did not wait for a second try. He ripped up the loose plank, shoved the lantern glass into the opening just long enough to blind whatever lay beneath, and saw only a slice of shoulder, a fur collar, and a knife flashing up from the black like a fish in ice water. He slammed the plank back and wedged it with the poker. The door on the far side of the hut shuddered at the same moment. Not one man now, two, maybe three. The Vorga were testing all sides at once, letting the storm cover their work. Outside, the wolves had gone silent, which was worse than the howling. Cal heard the quick rattle of claws across frozen crust, then a low whoof near the rear wall. Something large was circling the hut, keeping pace with the men. He looked at Nathan. "Can you walk?" Nathan swallowed blood and nodded too fast. "If I have to." "You do." Cal handed Elsie the cash twine and pointed to the rear board he'd loosened earlier. "If that plank lifts, pull the line toward you, hard. Don't let go." She took it with both hands. Then Cal did the thing the old wardens used to call laying a winter falsehood. He lit the lantern, but only enough to give the room a faint blue glow, and he set the flame beside the stove, not by the door. Any man watching through a crack would think the heat source sat still at center. Then he kicked the ash loose across the floor in a fresh sweep, opened the crawl space sack, and dumped the bitter meat bait near the back seam where the wolves had been nosing. One scent to pull the pack, one light to hold the men. He crouched to Nathan and spoke like a man talking to a field mule in bad weather. "You follow Elsie. Stay low. If I say run, you run without looking back." Elsie touched her father's sleeve once, then pointed at the floorboards under the stove. Cal understood at once. She had heard the movement too, not only under the wall, but beneath the center of the room. The old charcoal burner's hut was not just a hut. It had a shallow pit crawl built under the stove stones, and something was moving there. The floor gave another shiver. Cal set his jaw and stared at the trapdoor plank by the stove. The Vorga outside were not the only ones trying to come in. Then the lantern glow flickered, not from wind, but from something large and wet brushing the glass on the far side of the wall. Nathan. Nathan's warning had barely left his mouth when Cal got them moving. He shoved Elsie and her father toward the far corner of the hut, away from the stove and away from the floor seam. The room had taken on a bad life of its own now. The boards under Cal's boots gave a faint, hollow note, not solid wood, but an old crawl over dirt and ash. Under that note ran another sound, thin and scratchy, like someone dragging a nail through frozen clay. Outside, the wet brush at the wall moved again, slow and heavy, and a wolf breathed against the glass, with a sound like steam leaving a kettle. Cal bent low, ran his fingers along the stove base, and found what the old charcoal men always hid there, a flat iron cap under a crust of soot. He pried it loose with the poker. Cold air spilled up from below, smelling of old smoke, mouse droppings, and wet wool. There was a crawl space under the stones, deep enough for a man on his belly, deep enough for a knife. Elsie saw the look on his face and, without a word, picked up the twine and the tin cup and held them out to him. Cal took both. No fuss, no fear, just work. He tied the cup where the crawl seam met the stove leg, then looped the twine through the brace by the rear plank. If that hidden hand moved, the cup would sing. If the rear wall gave, he'd hear it. He had used better tools in worse weather, but not many. In the 30 below dark, simple things mattered. A rope, a sound, a second to think. Then the floor under the stove shifted, just enough to send a puff of ash up through the crack. Cal dropped to one knee, slammed the poker into the soot gap, and drove it sideways. There was a curse below him, muffled by dirt. A man. Close. Too close. Cal did not waste time wondering how long he'd been there. He knew enough already. The Vorga had sent one man to test the wall and another to worm up under the floor like a bad thought. He kicked the kettle off its hook, caught it with his left hand, and poured the scalding water into the cap opening in one hard stream. A burst of steam exploded out below, and the hidden man shouted, choking. Cal followed it with a fistful of dry ash and green pine needles, shoving them into the crack to foul the air. The crawl space coughed back. Then came the knife. A blade punched up between two boards, silver and quick. Cal caught it under the poker and pinned it there. Wood groaned. Something thrashed beneath him, heel hammering dirt. He leaned on the bar, hard, and heard a finger crack at the other end of the steel. The curse that came after that was ugly enough to make Nathan shut his eyes. Outside, the wolf at the wall gave one low snort, then moved away. Cal caught just a glimpse through the crack of a rawhide line on its neck, dark against the snow. Not wild. Guided. "Get back," he told Elsie quietly. "If that floor lifts, you stay on the wall and don't step over it." She nodded once. Cal shifted his weight, and something in the crawl space slid with him. A second shape. He heard the click of metal below the boards, sharp and deliberate, the sound of a rifle bolt being worked in the dark beneath their feet. Then a voice, breathless and furious, came up through the floor in a whisper meant for one man only. "Don't let him keep the map." And the boards under the stove started to rise. Cal did not waste breath answering the whisper from below. He drove the poker down into the rising boards and braced his boot on the stove stone, forcing the plank back into the dirt with a raw grind of wood on wood. The crawl space went quiet for one thin second. Then came the crack of a shot fired blind from under the floor. The bullet slammed upward through the stove base and spat sparks into the room. Elsie flinched but did not cry out. Nathan threw an arm over his face. Cal hit the ground flat, rolled once, and came up with the lantern in his left hand and the poker in his right. That was enough. He smashed the lantern against the nearest board seam, and the glass burst, oil flaring hot across the ash. The fire ran thin and fast along the crack. Not much, just enough to smoke the gap and make a man beneath it choke on his own breath. A curse burst up through the floor, then another, and the hidden rifle shifted with a metallic scrape. Cal jammed the poker through the opening and caught the barrel as it rose. Steel screamed on steel. The man below yanked back. Cal leaned his weight down and felt the barrel twist, the wood under it splitting wider. Then a hard hand grabbed at his boot from the dark. He stomped once, hard, and felt knuckles give, just enough to make the hand disappear. "Move," he snapped. Nathan lurched up, pale and trembling, while Elsie seized his arm and pulled. Good girl. Cal saw it all in flashes, the way a field man sees weather change on a ridge. The floorboards by the stove were lifting in 3 places now, not one. More than one man in the crawl. The Vorga had come under the hut the way winter rot eats a stump, from the inside out. Cal kicked the stove poker free, snatched the kettle, and slammed boiling water through the gap. Steam exploded in a white cloud that stung his eyes and turned the room into a brief, holy mess. Below him there was coughing, then a wet scream. Then the scrape of boots trying to retreat in dirt and ash. The rear wall shuddered. Cal heard it before he saw it. The wolves outside were still circling, but now one of them hit the wall with its shoulder. Not wild, not hungry, but driving. A rawhide line snapped tight, and the animal gave a strangled yelp. So that was the trick. The clan had tied a wolf to the hut to make noise and pressure, to keep the men below and the people inside from thinking straight. The forest takes its due, he thought, and men always try to collect it first. Nathan's voice came thin from the corner. "Cal." "I know." He was already moving. He hooked Elsie behind him with one arm and shoved her toward the rear crawl board he'd left loose earlier. "You first, down and left, stay by the wall." She went without a sound. Nathan followed, one hand on the satchel, the other clamped to his ribs. Cal dropped after him, shoulders scraping old dirt, and the cold under the hut hit like a church cellar. Tight, low, and smelling of iron filings. In the dark underfloor, one Vorga man was trying to crawl back toward the rear opening, with blood running down his wrist. Cal saw the white of his eyes and the shine of the knife in his hand. He seized the man by the collar and drove him face first into the dirt. Not to kill, to stop. The man hissed through clenched teeth, "You don't know what's in the map." Cal pinned him there and rumbled back, "I know enough." Above them, the floor boomed as another shot blasted through from the room side, and the hut's old bones started to groan. The crawl space was no longer a refuge. It was a throat, and the whole place was tightening around them. Cal planted his knee between the underfloor man's shoulders and kept him face down in the dirt, while the boards above them thudded and bowed like a drum skin. The hut gave a long, ugly groan. Somewhere over their heads, Nathan coughed once, sharp and wet, and Elsie's feet shifted without a sound as she stayed where Cal had told her. The man under him was young enough to still have soft skin at the jaw, but there was a hard scar along one ear and the stink of wet fur on his coat. Not a miner, not a hunter. Vorga through and through. Cal twisted the man's arm until a little grunt escaped his teeth. "Who's outside?" Cal asked. The answer came thin and angry. "You already know." Cal leaned closer, his forearm pressing the man's throat into the dirt. "How many?" A breath, a pause, then, "Enough to bury this place." That was not bravado. That was a man counting on weather and numbers. Cal heard it in the way the words shook. The crawl space was a choke point, a place the clan had used before, maybe on other storms, to slide under and over and around any shelter that stood between them and a witness. Above them, the rifle butt struck the floor once, twice. The old boards held, but each blow shook dust loose in gray ribbons. Cal could picture the room without seeing it. Nathan on the blanket, Elsie with both hands clenched around the twine, the stove breathing blue heat into the dark, and the wolves outside, quiet now, held at bay by a rawhide line and a man's patience. He drove two knuckles hard into the underfloor man's ribs. "Why the map?" The answer came through gritted teeth. "Because if the basin opens, the state comes in. Then the road comes. Then the rail. Then your kind." He spat dirt. "And the ore gets taken clean, with tax stamps on it." So there it was. Not greed in the simple sense. Greed with a sermon on top. Men always liked to dress theft up as stewardship when it was theirs. Cal had heard similar talk from officers, merchants, and politicians. Same smell, different coat. He looked up through the broken seam. One board had lifted a full finger's width now, enough for a knife. He slid the poker under the edge and wedged it hard, then reached with his other hand, feeling for the rifle he'd heard shifting below. Cold metal, a bolt action, good make, recent oil. He pulled it free just as the man beneath him lunged. The butt of the weapon caught the man's chin and snapped his head sideways with a crack that turned his shout into a choking whine. Cal did not finish him. He shoved him deeper into the crawl and pushed the rifle aside. "Stay down." A shout came from the far end of the room, above the floor. Nathan's voice, ragged and urgent. "Cal, the wall!" He looked up just in time to see a black shape drive itself against the rear boards from outside, then recoil. Not a wolf this time, a man. Then another impact, heavier, and the wall's skin bulged inward as if a shoulder had been thrown into it. The rawhide line must have snapped or been cut. The wolf outside had turned on the people steering it. For one breath, the whole hut held still. Then Elsie shouted for the first time, a single broken sound, and pointed toward the stove. Cal turned. The stove stones had shifted, not much, enough to show a seam where there had been none before. And from that seam came a narrow blade of candlelight, steady and deliberate, as if someone beneath the floor had lit a lantern on the other side of the room. Cal knew the crawl space was no longer just a hiding place the moment the pale line of candlelight held steady under the stove stones. Not a lantern shaken by panic, not a stray reflection, a proper flame, low and patient, as if somebody had set it there and meant to wait. He eased one hand back from the dirt and touched Elsie's ankle once, a small warning, then pointed at the wall nearest the stove. Nathan was breathing hard, but he nodded. He had gone too pale now to waste words. Above them, the hut boomed again, as wood gave somewhere overhead, and the 30 below dark outside seemed to press its face against every seam. Cal lowered his head and listened. One man was still in the crawl space with him, pinned and swearing through blood. Another sound came from farther back under the floor, a soft slide of knees, then the clink of metal against stone. There was another person beneath the room, maybe two. The Vorga had not come to breach the hut. They had come to divide it. He reached for the trapped rifle and tore it free from the man's grip. The barrel was warm from the blind shot. He worked the bolt once, felt the shell clear, then laid the weapon flat across the dirt with the muzzle pointed away from Elsie to keep it from being used against him while his hands were tied with the floor and the wall, both breathing. Above them, Nathan spoke in a cracked whisper. "Cal, what is it?" "A second lamp," Cal said, "under the stove." That was enough. No sermon, no mystery, just the shape of the problem. The flame under the stones moved once, then stopped. Whoever held it knew exactly where they were. Cal dug his fingers into the dirt and found the edge of a small metal cap hidden under old ash, then another beside it, a burner hatch. The old charcoal men had used these places to feed a clean draft under the stove and keep the smoke low. If there was a gap enough for air, there was a gap enough for a man's hand. He pressed his ear to the floorboard and heard a whisper from below, too faint to make out every word. Then one phrase drifted up clean as ice. "The seam stays ours." So there it was again, not weather, not hunger, ownership. Cal's mouth flattened. He looked at the rifle, then at the stove stones, then at Elsie. The girl had not moved an inch. She was watching the candle line under the floor like she could pin it with her eyes. There was a strange steadiness in her, the kind that comes from people who grow up around fear and learn where to put their hands when it starts. He took the poker, slipped its tip into the seam around the stove base, and pried. One stone shifted, then another. A draft came up cold and sharp, carrying coal dust, damp clay, and the smell of a man's sweat trapped in a hole too long. Cal widened the gap just enough to see the edge of a sleeve and the shine of a knife blade under the stove. He jammed the poker down hard. A grunt burst out below. The knife clattered. Then, from somewhere beyond the stove, another voice shouted, "He's got the floor!" Not a wolf, not a ghost. Men, close enough now to hear each other. Cal kicked the loose boards away from the stove mouth and shoved the rifle muzzle into the opening. He did not fire. He only held it there, making whoever was below think twice. The hidden candlelight shook, then inched backward. That was when the rear wall gave a long, cracking shiver, and from outside came a fresh sound through the storm. Not a howl, not a shout, but the low growl of an engine turning over somewhere in the trees. Cal heard the engine before he saw it, a low mechanical growl that did not belong in the timber country. It rolled through the storm from somewhere beyond the hut, rough and steady, with the coughing rhythm of an old motor forced to work in deep snow. That changed everything. Something heavier, something that could keep coming. He pushed his way out of the crawl space with the poker in one hand and the stolen rifle in the other, and the room above hit him like a furnace door opening. Smoke hung under the rafters. The stove had shifted sideways a finger's width. One of the rear boards was half lifted. Nathan was on one knee by the wall, white as paper, while Elsie stood beside him with both hands on the satchel strap, eyes fixed on the floor seam. "Stay down," Cal said. He crossed to the rear wall and felt the cold draft at the loose plank. The man from below had stopped shouting. Good. If he was alive, he was scared. If he was dead, one less thing to think about. Cal jammed the poker through the board gap and drove it down until the wood locked. Then he looked through the crack and saw what he needed. Lantern light moving between trees, bouncing off snow, coming closer. A beam, a hard white sweep, a search lamp. His stomach tightened. The Vorga had brought a vehicle, not out here by accident. That meant they had found a way around the drifts, and they were using the storm as cover to close the net from outside while their men worked the floor from below. It also meant they had confidence. Men only brought machines into a whiteout when they believed they already owned the night. Cal turned to Nathan. "How much can you walk?" Nathan gave him a crooked look. "Enough to hate it." "That'll do." He handed the surveyor the rifle and kept the poker. The weapon was awkward in Nathan's shaking hands, but the man knew enough to cradle it muzzle down. Elsie still said nothing. She only looked from Cal to the wall and then back toward the stove, waiting for the next instruction. Cal pointed once, low and firm, to the stove stones. "She's got a fire in the wall," Nathan whispered. "No," Cal said. "We've got a machine outside." He slid one of the stones out from the stove base and found the hidden draft channel beneath it, a narrow old burner trench running toward the rear seam. The light below was still there, thin and wavering. He could smell coal soot and damp wool. The crawlspace man was trying to back out, maybe with a second tool, maybe with a way to open the floor wide enough for the others to come through. Cal shoved the rifle barrel into the seam and waited. From below came a muffled shout, then a thud. The stove lamp outside the wall swept across the hut boards, and through the crack, Cal caught a flash of metal in the snow. A tracked machine, half buried, headlights hooded against the storm, men moving around it like ants around a carcass. One of them looked up toward the hut and raised a hand, a signal. Cal narrowed his eyes. They weren't coming in blind anymore. They were setting something. Then Elsie touched his elbow and pointed at the floor. The candlelight under the stove had vanished, and from below in the crawl space came the soft metallic click of a bolt being drawn back. Cal did not answer the click under the floor. He drove the rifle barrel down through the loosened seam and pinned the bolt in place before it could finish opening. Wood shuddered under his weight. Somewhere beneath him, a man hissed in pain and then went still, like he had swallowed his own tongue. Nathan was on his feet now, swaying, and Elsie had backed to the wall with the satchel hugged tight to her chest. No one spoke for a second. In that white, stale air, the hut sounded alive in the wrong way. Outside, the engine growl returned, low and patient, not close enough to break the wall yet, close enough to make the floor tremble under Cal's boot. He caught the smell of diesel through the smoke and ash, sharp as a cut on the tongue. This was no wandering trapper's rig. This was a machine built to work a line, to haul men and steel through the timber, whether the timber wanted it or not. He crawled to the rear crack and looked out. The beam of a hooded lamp cut through the storm, not sweeping wild now, but stopping on points, like an officer's finger. A half-track tractor sat nose first in the drift below the trees, one track buried to the axle, the other churning black slush. Beside it stood 3 men in fur collars and wet canvas, one of them holding a survey pole, another shaking out bright flagging tape that flashed red against the snow. A radio set crackled from inside the cab, and for one clear moment Cal heard a voice answer in flat, ugly calm. "Mark the route. The basin opens by dawn." That changed the room in him. Until then it had been survival, simple and brutal. Keep the weak breathing, keep the walls up, keep the wolves and the clan away. But that sentence in the snow turned the whole thing over. They were not just trying to kill witnesses. They were mapping a road through the valley, opening the timber country like a carcass and calling it progress. If they reached the railhead with that line, the whole basin would be cut open by morning. Cal knew that kind of damage. He had seen it in uniforms and in suits. Different hands, same knife. He backed away from the crack and looked at Nathan. "How long can you stand?" Nathan let out a thin laugh that was mostly breath. "Long enough to ruin your day, maybe." "Good." Cal pointed to Elsie. "You keep the satchel on you. If I tell you to move, you move with him. No questions." She nodded once, not frightened, focused. That steadiness again. He dropped to one knee beside the stove and drew a finger through the ash on the stone floor, tracing the hut, the machine outside, the rear crawl space, the tree line. Old habit, old map. In the wolf-haunted timber, a man had to think like weather and timber both. Where the pressure came from, where it would break. He saw it then. If the crew outside pushed in the open, they'd use the tractor as cover. If they found the rear crawl, they'd come through the floor. The hut was a hinge, and it would open whichever side he let breathe first. "Listen to me," he said, voice low. "This isn't just our hole anymore. It's a line they want." Nathan stared at the ash map, then at the wall, and understanding settled over his face in a slow, sick way. From somewhere farther off in the storm, beyond the first machine, came another engine. Distant, deeper, coming in from the opposite side of the basin. Cal went still at the sound. They were getting boxed in. Cal. The ash map was still on the floor when the next vibration came through the hut, deeper than the engine and slower too, like something heavy rolling over frozen ground. Cal did not need to see the outside to know the line had widened. One machine at the front, another somewhere farther off, and now the woods themselves were carrying the sound from both sides of the basin. He knelt, put 2 fingers on the dirt beside the stove, and felt the tremor travel through the floorboards like a pulse under skin. The Vorga were no longer probing. They were building a corridor. Nathan saw it too. His face had gone gray around the mouth. "They're closing us in." "Yes." Cal took the poker, hooked the edge of the stove stone, and slid the iron cap back over the draft gap. He did not want the rear crawl space lit up from below. Not now. Not when men with radios and a route marker outside had started treating the hut like a knot to be untied. Elsie remained by the wall, one hand on the satchel, her eyes moving from Cal to the door, to the floor, and back again. She had the look of someone learning, fast, the exact shape of danger. "Move to the corner," Cal told them, "away from the stove. If they breach the wall, they'll come in low." Nathan gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sounds like you've done this before." "Not with a tractor." He crossed to the rear crack and looked out just long enough to take the measure. The search lamp was gone from the direct line, replaced by 2 smaller lights. Men were moving them wide, setting angles. A red strip of flagging tape fluttered from one boot as he walked. Cal knew that trick too. Mark the sight lines, mark the approach, turn a storm into a field chart. The forest takes its due from men who think paper can tame it. Then he saw the second machine. Not close, not as heavy as the first. A sled-mounted generator rig, maybe, or a skidded winch with a light tower bolted to the frame. Enough to power the lamp. Enough to drag cable. Enough to make a dark place bright. His jaw tightened. They were not just seeking the hut anymore. They were building a work site. Cal turned back inside, took Nathan by the elbow, and knelt so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me. If that second engine reaches the ridge, they'll have light enough to see through every tree between here and the pass." Nathan stared at him. And then The basin is open. No one needed more than that. Cal reached into the oilskin cache and pulled out the last strip of dried meat, broke it in half, and handed one piece to Elsie. He kept the other for Nathan. It wasn't kindness, it was timing. A man thinking about food did not panic as hard as a man thinking about dying hungry. He learned that from a winter medic in a tent outside Magadan, and he had carried it like a prayer ever since. Outside, a burst of radio static flared and cut off. Then a voice, faint but clear enough to carry through the cracks, said, "Front marker set. Wait for the signal." Signal. Cal looked at the rear wall and then at the stove stones. That was the new piece. They were not just closing the hut. They were waiting for an external cue to hit it from all sides. He could feel the shape of it now. Tractor at the front, crawl space at the rear, wolves held on lines in the timber, and somewhere beyond the drift, a man with a radio and a map ready to burn into the snow. He lifted the rifle he'd taken earlier and checked the chamber. 1 round, maybe 2. Not enough for a war, enough for a moment. He handed the poker to Nathan. If the wall goes, strike low, at hands, not heads. Nathan frowned. "You serious?" "I am always serious when people start digging under my feet." A hard knock came from the rear wall, then another, and the whole hut answered with a long, wooden groan. Cal braced, feet set, eyes on the seam. Outside, the nearest engine rose in pitch. Then the radio voice returned, louder this time, right before the static swallowed it. "Cut the lamp. We go on the signal." And in the same breath, somewhere above the ridge, a flare went up over the trees. Cal did not waste time staring at the flare. He threw Nathan and Elsie into the corner behind the stove and slapped a hand once against the wall plank, the old signal for stay low and stay still. Nathan got the meaning at once. Elsie already had. The girl bent over the satchel, one arm over it like a shield, and Cal felt a hard little knot of respect in his chest for the way she could take fear and make it sit down. The hut shuddered again, not from the wind, from the machines now working both sides of the basin. Cal moved to the rear seam, shoved the poker through the crack, and eased up the loose board just enough to breathe through it. Cold rushed in. Diesel came with it, thick and oily. The nearest lamp tower was outside, and the light it threw was so bright the snow looked blue at the edges. Men were out there, setting a line of flagging tape between stakes, turning the ridge into a road by inches. One of them carried a radio under his coat. Another had a long-handled pry bar and a roll of cable over one shoulder. That was the shape of it now, not a raid, a build. Cal took the last strip of dried meat from his pocket, tied it to a length of twine, and looked toward the back wall where the wolf had been nosing the boards. He had no wish to shoot his way out of this. There were too many angles, too many moving parts, and too few rounds in the rifle. But a man with a warden's hands can still move a pack if he understands what it wants. He slipped the twine through the rear crack and let the meat drop into the snow outside. Then he cut the rawhide thong he'd spotted earlier, the one that had been controlling the nearest wolf. The animal lurched free at once, white teeth flashing in the tower light, fur bristling with the storm on its back. It did not come for Cal. It came for the sound and smell of the new machine. The first shout outside was short and surprised. The wolf hit the cable sled hard, jaws snapping at the wheel housing while 2 men flung themselves backward in the snow. Cal was already moving. He shoved the poker into the lamp tower guy line, twisted it, and heard rope fibers hiss apart. The tower leaned. Sparks spat from the generator housing as the wolf struck again, and one man swung a pry bar wildly, striking only snow and air. "Down!" somebody yelled. The light tower pitched sideways, and Cal rammed the poker deeper until the guy line gave all at once. The whole frame came down with a metallic shriek, smashing into the drift and burying the lamp in a burst of glass and orange sparks. The basin dropped back into blackness so fast it felt like a blow. One of the men screamed, not from pain, but from being blinded. Cal was already halfway back to the hut when the radio on the fallen rig crackled loud in the dark. A voice answered, sharp and annoyed, then cut into static. "Where's the marker? Report!" No one answered. Through the gap in the snow glare, Cal caught one more thing. The second engine was no longer far. It had crested the opposite shoulder and was rolling straight toward the hut, its headlamps low and steady, like eyes learning the shape of a prey trail. Behind it, through the storm, he heard the thin, metallic clatter of a track chain working over ice. Nathan's voice came from inside, tight and thin. "Cal?" He reached the door and looked through the cracked board just long enough to see the light closing in on them. And then, from the dark beyond the ridge, a horn sounded once, slow, deep, and answering the engine. Cal. The horn was not for him. It was for the men on the ridge, and Cal knew it the second the note rolled through the timber. He turned from the crack, shoved Nathan and Elsie deeper into the corner behind the stove, and kept his voice low enough to stay under the wood's groan. "No sudden moves. If the wall gives, stay flat and keep your heads down." Nathan nodded once, face tight with pain. Elsie did not nod. She was already watching the floor, reading the room the way Cal read snow. Outside, the engine on the near side climbed another notch in pitch. The far engine answered from the opposite shoulder. The basin was boxed now, clean and slow, the way hunters close around a stag. Cal crouched by the stove stones and pressed his ear to the floor. That was when he heard it. A faint hiss under the boards, thin as a kettle steam line. Fuse. He slid the poker into the seam and hooked up the nearest board. Underneath, in the dirt and old soot, lay a short string of black powder cord with a waxed paper cap tied to it. A charge. Not large enough to blow the hut apart by itself, but enough to crack a corner and bring men through. Enough to kill if someone was standing wrong. Cal did not curse. He pinched the burning end between two fingers, burned his skin to the bone, then buried the tip in a mouthful of wet ash scooped from the stove tray. The hiss died. He breathed once, hard. Whoever had laid that fuse expected the flare to draw them in at the same time the wall went. He looked up at Nathan. They were going to pop the floor. Nathan's eyes widened, then narrowed with a kind of sick understanding. While the machines came in, while we were looking the other way. Cal shoved the ash back into the seam and pressed the board down flat. Then he took the strip of rawhide he'd cut earlier from the wolf line and tied it to the meat bait. Not for the wolves exactly, for the direction they'd take when they smelled blood and fat and diesel all in one place. He slipped to the rear crack and lowered the bait into the snow just enough to catch the wind. It worked at once. Out in the dark, the nearest wolf answered with a rough, hungry snort and came in low, shoulders rolling under the storm. The rawhide line on its neck still tugged from somewhere, but not hard enough now to stop the animal from choosing. It hit the snow between the hut and the light tower rig, jaws open, and the men outside shouted over one another in surprise. Cal saw his chance. He rapped the poker once against the stove cap, then once on the floor. Old wardens knew the sound of panic in a pack. The wolf veered toward the machine, and behind it came another, then another, ghosting out of the 30 below dark as if the timber itself had sent them. One man swung a pry bar and missed. Another slammed the lamp tower guy line with his boot, trying to keep balance. The whole line buckled under the animal's weight and the men's noise. "Cal?" Nathan whispered. "Stay where you are." He did not say what he knew. The storm had stopped being weather an hour ago. The forest takes its due from people who feed it fire and metal and blood, and tonight it seemed eager to collect. The second engine was still coming, slow and steady, its headlamps moving through the trees like pale eyes learning the shape of the hut. Cal felt the old war inside him wake up sharp and clean. Not fear, procedure. He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber by touch, then set it low by the crack. The cable outside went tight with a metallic twang. Someone was winching, and whatever they had hooked on the far side of the basin was about to pull hard enough to tear the hut open at the seam. Cal. The horn had been a signal, and Cal knew it before the note had fully died in the trees. He stepped back from the door crack and flattened himself against the stove wall, while Nathan dragged Elsie lower into the corner. The hut was taking strain from every side now. The rear seam gave a dry pop. Somewhere under the floor, a man swore through clenched teeth. Outside, the engine noise swelled and then broke into a hard metallic clatter as something heavy shifted in the snow. Cal's mind went to work without hurry. Horn, engines, wind line. That meant the assault was not random. They were waiting for a single cue to hit the hut while the basin was lit and the pack was moving. He had seen it in field exercises and in bad ambushes, the same old prayer with a different coat on it. First the noise, then the pressure, then the thing that breaks. He crawled to the stove stones and lifted one just enough to look into the draft gap. Through it, he saw the lamp tower rig still tilted in the drift, its frame sparking faintly where the cable had torn loose. Beyond that, half lost in the whiteout, the second machine was coming over the shoulder of the ridge, a low tractor with a skidded winch behind it, and two men on the rear step, one of them carrying a flare gun. The flare had to be what they wanted. Light the ridge, show the route, start the pull. Cal whispered, "They're not here for us alone." Nathan blinked at him. "What else is there?" "The map," Cal said, "and the road it makes." That answer settled over the room like ash. Elsie tightened both hands on the satchel strap. Cal saw her jaw set, a small, hard line in the dimness. She was not asking him to explain. She was waiting to be useful. He liked that more than he should have. A scrape came from the rear wall, then a grunt, then the crunch of someone setting weight against the boards outside. Cal slid the rifle barrel through the crack and held it still. Not enough rounds to start a war, enough to change one man's mind. He watched the wall bulge inward a finger's width, then another. The hut's old cedar skin moaned like an animal in the cold. Outside, one of the Vorga shouted over the engine, "Set the winch!" So there it was. They meant to pull the hut apart like a rotten hide. Cal looked once at Nathan, once at Elsie, and made the choice. "Corner, stay low." Then he crossed to the rear opening, seized the hanging twine line, and yanked the last bit of bait meat through the gap. The wolves answered at once. They did not howl. They rushed the nearest smell. 3 of them came out of the timber low and fast, ears pinned flat, drawn by diesel, blood, and the bait he had salted with ash. One hit the rear machine's track housing and went under it with a savage yelp. Another slammed into the man with the flare gun. The flare fired sideways into the snow and burst uselessly against a spruce trunk in a sheet of red sparks. The ridge lit for one brief heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Cal saw the winch cable already running toward the hut. It was hooked to something low, buried in drift, something that had a dark metal hook driving into the hut's side plank by plank, a harpoon anchor. Cal saw the trick in the same breath he saw the cable. The line was not pulling the hut alone. It was pulling something buried in the drift beyond the rear wall, something long and narrow that kept dragging with a hard, grinding bite through ice. He crouched, jammed his fingers into the ash on the floor, and followed the trimmer like a man reading a pulse. The tug had a rhythm, 2 short pulls, 1 long haul, then a pause. That was not random work. That was a man setting a trap with patience. "Corner," he told Nathan and Elsie. "Stay off the floorboards." Nathan, pale and sweating now, half lifted himself and looked at the stove seam, then at Cal. "What is it?" "A charge," Cal said, "or something tied to one." The words landed heavy. Elsie's hands tightened on the satchel strap until her knuckles showed white through the wool. The wolf-haunted timber outside groaned with another gust, and the hut answered in kind. Cal moved to the rear crack and looked out just enough to catch the machine light. The nearer tractor was still there, half turned in the drift, its nose shoved against a ridge of snow like it was trying to burrow in. Beside it, two men leaned into a cable reel, while a third stood with the flare gun, waiting on the ridge signal. Then Cal saw the low shape in the snow, a metal tube, half buried and wrapped in canvas, being dragged toward the hut on the end of the harpoon line. A blasting charge. Old road work, maybe. The kind men used to break frozen ground or tear out a stump without thinking too hard about who was standing nearby. His mouth went dry. They were not trying to crack the wall. They were pulling the charge under the hut and letting the timbers take it. Cal grabbed the stove poker and jammed it through the side plank where the cable bit in. The wood split a little farther. He hooked the line and hauled sideways with both hands. Outside, the cable went taut. One of the men shouted. The tractor lurched. Snow sprayed from the track. For 1 second, the charge stopped dead, half buried and half free, and Cal could smell the oily stink of the blasting cap through the crack. Nathan had already understood. He took the rifle with shaking hands and put the barrel through the rear gap the way Cal had shown him, not to fire at the engine, to keep the men honest. Cal gave him one sharp nod. "Hold that line," he said. Then he ducked low, slid the poker under the stove base, and shoved the loosened stone aside. The old burner draft opened beneath him with a cold breath. He dropped one knee into the crawl space, then the other, and crawled 3 feet backward through soot and dirt until he could see the underside of the rear wall. The cable was running straight through a hole chewed in the old timber. If it kept moving, the charge would reach the foundation in seconds. He reached up, caught the cable with both hands, and burned his palms on the wire wrap as he jammed it around the poker shaft like a winding drum. The line screamed under tension. Outside, the machine answered with a shudder. Cal dug his boots into the dirt, braced, and pulled the cable into a snag against the stove brace. For 1 heartbeat, it held. Then the far ridge lit with a flare. Not red, white. And in that white flash, Cal saw the fuse cord on the buried charge spark to life. Cal saw the white flare hit the ridge and knew the charge had just been lit. The old reflex came back first, procedure. He slammed his shoulder into the stove and kicked the loose stones aside, forcing the draft gap open wide enough to breathe through. Heat rushed out, soot and cold air came in. Nathan and Elsie were already dropping low on his order, the surveyor dragging himself behind the stove base while the girl folded in beside him, eyes fixed on Cal's hands like they were the only honest thing left in the hut. Outside, the explosion did not come at once. The fuse had to run first. That tiny delay was worse than the blast. Cal could hear everything in it. The cable singing under strain, the wolves snarling at the rear machine, a man shouting somewhere beyond the snow. Then the charge hit. The hut took the blow from below and to the left, a brute shove. The floor under the stove jumped hard enough to throw ash into the air, and a corner plank split with a crack like a rifle shot. Cal drove the poker into the gap before the boards could rise a second time and heard the wedge of steel bite into something soft on the other side. A hand. No scream, just a wet, choking sound, then the sudden scrape of boots in dirt under the hut. "Back!" Cal barked. Nathan and Elsie crawled deeper into the corner as the front wall shuddered from the pull of the cable outside. The winch was still working. Whoever was on the tractor hadn't seen the charge go off yet, or they didn't care. Either way, they meant to keep hauling until something gave. Cal grabbed the rifle, shoved the barrel through the split in the rear wall, and fired once into the snow-bright shape of the machine line. He did not aim for a man. He aimed for the cable reel. The round struck metal with a sharp clang, and the reel kicked sideways. The line went slack, then snapped taut again in a hard jerk that made the harpoon anchor shudder against the hut plank. Good. He reached down, caught the cable with one hand, and hauled it inward while the storm-rotted wood around him groaned. Outside, men were shouting over one another now, and the flare light on the ridge flickered wild, throwing broken white over the trees. Cal saw enough through the crack to know the basin had turned into a trap of its own. One machine stalled in the drift, another trying to push through from the far side. Wolves at the edges, drawn by blood and metal and noise. That was the forest taking its due. The charge under the hut coughed once more and died with a sizzle in the mud. Whatever the blast had been meant to do, it had failed to make a clean wound. Cal yanked the poker free and looked down. The loose floorboards were split, but the foundation still stood. A bad fracture, not a collapse. Enough to crawl under, not enough to fall through. Nathan coughed hard, then managed. "Can we move?" Cal looked at the wall, at the rear seam, at the cable outside now whipping free in the snow. He thought for one quick moment of the long black years that had gotten him to this exact kind of night, and then he shoved that thought aside. Not yet. He dragged the oilskin cache closer, ripped open the last wrap of dried meat, and pressed half into Elsie's hand. Then he put the rest in Nathan's palm. Fuel, in a way. Not for the body, for the will. Around them, the hut shook again as the tractor outside tried to back out of the drift, and the cable hooked somewhere in the trees. The line tightened. The rear wall bent inward. Cal leaned close to the crack and saw the machine's headlights swing toward them, low and yellow through the snow, while on the ridge the horn sounded again. This time, much closer. Cal did not have time to think about the horn. He had time to move, and that was enough. He shoved Nathan and Elsie hard toward the stove corner, then spun back to the rear seam just as the cable outside gave a sharp metallic snap. The hut lurched. Snow dust fell from the rafters in a dirty gray veil. Somewhere beyond the wall, the engine on the ridge roared like a beast waking up angry. The cable had gone taut again, harder this time. Cal threw his shoulder into the stove brace and drove the poker into the floor crack, hooking the line below. The rope bit into his hands through the soot and frost. He felt the pull transmit through the hut, straight into his bones. Outside, something heavy was trying to drag the wall off its foundation. A machine's, the kind that did not care if timber or bone got in the way. Nathan, white-faced and shaking, stared at the floor. "What are they doing?" "Trying to peel us open," Cal said. That was the truth of it. A demolition. The poachers had gone from hunting witnesses to opening a route, and the hut had become one more obstacle in the basin. Cal had seen the same kind of work on rotten bridge pilings and frozen culverts. Get the tension right, set the anchor, pull until the old wood gives. The forest takes its due, all right, and men always try to collect it first. Elsie looked from the wall to Cal's hands. No tears, no noise, just that hard, frightened focus again. She stepped to the stove, picked up the kettle with both mittens, and held it ready without being told. Cal gave her a quick glance. Good. She was learning the shape of the fight. Outside, through a crack in the boards, he caught a flash of movement in the storm glow. A man on the ridge with a flare gun, and behind him, the second machine nosing up the shoulder, low and steady. The front machine had stalled in the drift, but the rear one had gotten the angle. That meant the line was now pulling from two sides. If the cable anchor held, the hut would split. If it failed, the whole rig would come in on top of them. Cal didn't shoot. He couldn't waste a round on fear. Instead, he dropped flat, slid his arm under the stove base, and found the old iron draft cap he'd been shifting in and out all night. Beneath it was the burner throat, narrow as a fist. He shoved the poker through the opening and twisted hard. The cable outside shrieked, then jumped a hand's width as the hook and the drift shifted. One of the men shouted, another answered. Then the machine line yanked again, and the wall bowed inward. Not much. Enough. Cal looked up at Nathan. "When I say go, you take the girl and get to the back crawl. Stay low. Don't stop for anything." Nathan swallowed. "And you?" "I'm going to make them regret bringing a winch into my night." He planted his feet, jammed the poker deeper, and felt the cable twist around the stove brace like a snake around a tree. Then, in the white glare outside, the flare gun cracked. A flare arced over the basin, bright as a wound. Cal glanced out just in time to see the hook line cinch tight against the hut wall, and under that hook, a second metal shape beginning to rise out of the snow. Cal saw the hook line lift the buried weight and knew the wall had only seconds left. He barked one word, low and flat. "Move." Nathan grabbed Elsie by the shoulder and shoved her toward the rear crawl the way Cal had shown them before. No panic now, just motion. The girl glanced once at Cal, then slipped down into the dark gap without a sound, the satchel held tight against her chest. Nathan followed, half crawling, half dragging his bad side. The hut shuddered so hard the kettle jumped from the stove and cracked on the floor. Outside, the flare light washed the snow in harsh white, and the 30 below dart beyond it looked almost black enough to touch. Cal did not wait for the next pull. He drove the poker through the stove brace and jammed the cable hard against the iron cap, then yanked the cap free with his other hand. The old burner throat opened under his fingers, hot ash and stale soot breathing back at him. He rammed the poker deeper, turning the line around the brace like a winding drum. The cable screamed. Somewhere on the ridge, a man shouted. The machine answered with a grinding jerk that tore a splinter from the rear wall. Then Cal dropped to his belly and went under the floor. The crawl space smelled of damp clay, old smoke, and the sour iron stink of fresh powder. The boards above him hammered with the cable's strain, and in the narrow dark ahead he saw a man's boot, then a knee, then the glint of a knife trapped in one hand. The Vorga man had got in from the rear gap while the machines were pulling. He was young, broad-shouldered, face streaked with soot, and he was hammering a short iron spike into the foundation like he meant to finish the hut from underneath. Cal hit him hard with the poker across the wrist. The knife clattered. The man twisted, snarling, and drove an elbow into Cal's ribs. Cal grunted, caught the man's collar, and slammed his face into the dirt so hard his teeth clicked. The spike half sank, then stopped. Under the man's coat, Cal saw a leather pouch tied with wire and waxed thread. Detonator charge. Small, ugly, and meant for the last clean blow. The poacher spat blood and whispered, breathless and fevered. "You think this is about you?" Cal drove the poker tip under his chin and held him there. "It's always about somebody's greed." The man laughed once, a wet sound, and tried to twist toward the pouch. "The buyer's already measured the basin. By dawn, it'll be open." Cal froze for half a beat. Buyer. Not a clan feud. Not just theft. Someone beyond the timber had put a price on the whole valley, and these men were only the hands. Above them, the wall gave a long crack like splitting ice. He let the poacher drop, crawled backward through the soot, and came up through the stove gap just as the rear beam bowed inward. Nathan and Elsie were in the crawl, waiting by the wall, faces dim in the dark hole. Cal saw fear in the man's eyes, but no surrender. Good. He pointed once toward the ravine side of the hut. "Through there when the beam drops, stay low and don't look back." Nathan opened his mouth to ask something, but the hut answered for him. A fresh line of steel screamed outside, and the rear wall burst inward a full hand's width. Through the split, Cal caught a glimpse of the ridge and the machine beyond it, then a second set of headlights rising from the far side of the basin, slow and steady, as if the timber itself were bringing in another witness. And on the radio, thin through the static, a voice said, very clear, "Open the gate. The buyer wants the first samples by dawn." Cal saw the second metal shape rising out of the snow and knew the ridge had handed him the last clean chance it was going to get. He barked for Nathan and Elsie to move before the wall had time to fail. Nathan got one arm around the girl and shoved her toward the rear crawl, both of them bent low and moving by touch more than sight. The hut was shaking in hard little bursts now, not the long groan of weather, but the violent tug of steel. The machine outside had the line again. The harpoon anchor in the snow was lifting. If it came free, the next pull would take the whole wall seam with it. Cal did not fire. He could see the man on the ridge with the flare gun and another crouched by the winch, but he needed both to stay busy. He grabbed the poker, hooked the cable where it bit through the rear plank, and jammed the iron down hard against the stove brace. The cable screamed. The sound went straight through the hut and into his teeth. Outside, a shout, then another. The line jerked, and the buried anchor shifted sideways instead of up. That mattered. Not a little. Enough. The hook had not cleared the drift yet, and the angle was wrong. Cal threw his weight into the poker and twisted until the cable wound around the brace like a snare around a deer leg. The metal burned through his glove. He felt the skin split under it. He did not let go. Nathan, half in the crawl already, looked back and saw the line straining. "Cal! Go!" The surveyor vanished down the dark gap with Elsie behind him. The girl did not make a sound, but she turned once, fast, and Cal saw her eyes fixed on him, wide and hard and older than they had any right to be. Then the floor dropped from under the left rear corner with a crack that sounded like a branch breaking on deep ice. The harpoon anchor had finally reached the surface. Not far, just enough. It punched through the snow outside with a jerk, and the whole winch line snapped tight. Cal felt the hut lurch on its foundation. One wall plank tore free and slammed inward, throwing splinters across the stove. Through the opening, he caught a flash of men on the ridge moving in the flare glow, and behind them, the white glare of another machine cutting across the basin from the far side. The poachers had gone from hunting the valley to trying to strip it open all at once. That was when the wolves answered. Not a howl, a rush. The nearest ones hit the machine line and the track housing, drawn by blood, noise, and the stink of hot oil. One black shape went under the winch rig with a yelp, then came out limping and blind with blood on its muzzle. Another slammed into the man by the flare gun and sent him sliding in the snow. Cal heard the gun go off by accident, the flare skipping sideways into the white, spitting sparks over the drift. Good. Let 'em all look at light. He shoved the poker deeper into the cable wrap and kicked the stove base with everything he had. The iron cap gave way at the seam. Hot ash burst out across the floor. The cable snagged on the brace, twisted, and held just long enough for the outer machine to lurch backward into its own track ruts. The winch line whipped tight, then slackened with a metallic snap, so loud it felt like the basin itself had cracked. The wall finally gave in the corner. Not a collapse, a wound. Cold rushed through the gap. Snow followed. Cal dropped flat, grabbed the rifle, and crawled toward the rear opening where Nathan and Elsie were waiting in the crawl dark. Nathan's face was washed gray by the little light from the stove crack, but he was still upright, still holding the satchel. He nodded once toward Cal, then toward the opening beyond him. Outside, beyond the hut, the farm machine's headlights were getting closer again. And on the ridge, through the smoke of the flare and the white of the storm, a voice called out over the radio, calm as prayer. "Bring the samples down. The buyer's coming in person." Cal. Cal did not let the horn keep hold of him. He shoved Nathan and Elsie through the rear crawl just as the wall shuddered under the next pull. The opening was narrow, half choked with soot and loose earth, and the cold on the far side bit like a blade. Nathan came out first into the drift behind the hut, bent over and breathing through his teeth. Elsie followed, still silent, the satchel clutched so tight it looked fused to her chest. Cal came last, dragging the rifle and poker after him, and closed the loose board with one hand before the winch line could drag it wide again. They were in a shallow ravine behind the charcoal hut, half hidden by dead spruce and a bank of old snow that had crusted over in the storm. Ahead, through the whiteout, the ridge lights blinked in and out, and somewhere beyond them the engine growl rolled on, steady and mean. Cal dropped to one knee, listened, and heard more than he wanted. Boots in snow, men shouting over each other, and the wet clank of metal being unloaded from a machine bed. "Can you walk?" he asked Nathan. Nathan gave a cough that tasted like blood and nodded anyway. "If I have to." "You do." Cal pointed them to the left, where a line of old stump shadows ran downhill toward thicker timber. "Stay low. Don't break the crust unless you have to. If they see fresh cuts in the snow, we're done." Elsie looked up at him once. Then she reached into the satchel and, without a word, pressed the map case against Nathan's side, as if to remind him what all this was about. The gesture was small, but it landed hard. The surveyor took it like a man taking back a piece of his own spine. They moved in a crouch through the ravine, snow hissing under their boots. Cal went first, reading the ground as he went, choosing where the crust would hold and where it would sink. The whiteout swallowed everything above the waist, and the timber made a black wall around them. Twice he stopped them under dead branches, until a burst of light swept the slope behind. Once, a wolf silhouette crossed between the machines and the hut, shoulders low, tail stiff, still wearing the faint rawhide line on its neck. It did not come for them. It went toward the noise. That bought them a little time. At the mouth of the ravine, Cal flattened himself behind a fallen cedar and looked back. The nearest machine had stopped on the ridge. Men were gathering around it, and one of them had opened a steel case on the rear bed. Inside, under a layer of wax cloth, were short drill cores and a metal tube case stamped with a company mark. First samples, or the first proof of what they had come to steal. Cal felt his jaw harden. Not just poachers now. Not just the clan. Somebody had brought a business plan into the timber and dressed it in fur. Then the lead machine door swung open. A man stepped down into the snow wearing a clean, dark coat too fine for the basin, fur at the collar still white with frost. He did not stumble. He did not hurry. One gloved hand carried a walking stick he did not need. The other held a leather satchel thick enough to hide a ledger or a weapon, maybe both. He stood there while the men around him made room, like he owned the drift and the ridge and the air above it. The buyer. He turned his head toward the hut, then toward the ravine, and even at that distance, through the storm and the engine smoke, Cal saw the man's face change into something close to a smile. Cal saw the buyer smile and answered it with motion, not words. He drove Nathan and Elsie deeper into the ravine, past the dead spruce and the hard-crusted snow, toward a low break in the bank where old timber had once been dragged out by sled. The whiteout had thinned to a dirty gray, just enough to show the basin around them as a broken bowl of drift and engine light. Somewhere behind, the poachers were shouting over one another. Somewhere ahead, the rail cut ran under a lip of ice that Cal had noticed hours ago and not forgotten. Men who build roads learn to remember weak ground. "Down there," he said, "no noise." Nathan limped along, one hand clamped to his ribs, the other still holding the satchel. Elsie moved close on his left, one mitten touching his sleeve every few steps so he would not drift. That small touch kept them together better than any rope could have. Cal climbed first to the edge of the cut, laid flat on his belly, and looked under the snow shelf. There it was, a rotten old drainage trench, half buried, with frozen slush hanging in slabs from a timber lip above it. If the bank gave, anything on top would go nose first into the hole and stay there. Cal backed down, took the last of the cable from his glove and looped it around a dead cedar trunk. Then he pulled a smoking remnant of the poacher's blasting cord from his pocket, the piece he had burned free earlier and never thrown away. He pressed it into the slush at the base of the shelf, not deep, just enough to hold heat and panic in the same place. When he struck the flare, the red light made the snow look wet. The buyer saw it. Of course he did. Men like that always saw the light and missed the pit. He came down the slope in his clean, dark coat, boots slipping, one hand out as if the basin belonged to him and the weather ought to excuse him. 2 armed men followed, then a third with the radio set, still trying to talk to somebody who was not answering anymore. The buyer called out, smooth as a lawyer in a warm room. "You can still walk away from this, Warden. We take the cores, you take your girl, and no one has to freeze under the timber." Cal stood up slowly. Snow brushed off his shoulders. He held the rifle low, not because he was afraid, but because he did not need to point it to be heard. "You came too far for a man who still thinks he's negotiating." The buyer's eyes flicked to Nathan, then to Elsie, then to the satchel. The smile was gone now. He made one sharp gesture to his men, and the first of them started toward the ravine lip. That was the mistake. Cal jerked the cable hard against the cedar trunk. The flare burned hotter for one heartbeat, and the rotten shelf above them broke with a sound like the valley itself cracking. Snow, slush, and half-frozen timber dropped as one. The leading machine lurched sideways and nosedived into the drainage trench. The man with the radio vanished under a sheet of white and mud. One of the poachers screamed and grabbed for the track housing, only to have the bank give again under his feet. The buyer stumbled back, coat split open, one hand catching the edge of the bank just long enough to see his own road disappear under him. He looked up at Cal once, stunned and naked in the storm. Worse, surprise. Then the snow shelf gave the last of its weight and folded in on the machine with a heavy, final groan. The engine barked once and died. The buyer vanished from sight behind a burst of slush and broken wood. Cal did not cheer. He just stood there while the basin went quiet in pieces, wolves picking off the edges, men shouting from below, the whiteouts swallowing the rest. By the time the ridge cleared enough to see again, the trench was a frozen wound, and the clean coat was nowhere in sight. Dawn found them at the railhead under a pale sky the color of ash. Nathan stood upright on his own feet this time. The survey lines rolled in one arm, Elsie beside him with the satchel and the last strip of red flagging tied to her wrist. The station lantern smoked in the cold, and the agent on the platform read the map twice before he said a word. Then he looked at Cal's torn coat, at Nathan's blood-dark bandage, at the girl who never wasted emotion, and he nodded, like a man seeing law arrive in human shape for once. A red strip of survey tape hung from the rail post by morning, and it pointed back out of the basin instead of into it. That was enough. The rest could wait for thaw. Cal stood beside the stove barrel outside the station and let the steam warm his hands. Elsie stepped up, reached into her coat, and pressed the old warden's badge into his palm without a word. It had been bent flat by winter and hard use, but the pin still held. If this one kept you through the cold, stay with me and subscribe for the next long winter story. And if you want, leave a comment with the moment you knew the basin had turned.